looking at we're looking at this idea of what happens when grant making or funding and civic action converge, and how do we use that as fuel to build inside out change. And we're going to hear some great stories of how this is happening in Indianapolis. And then from that, I think that'll illustrate how you could do the same in your community. So again, just a huge thank you to our guests. I'll say a couple of notes about this. DeAmon is considered, in fact, named by groups like the Kettering Foundation, that he's one of the top organizers, just to go along with what Jay was saying, in the country. And so just really great to have you here. Also the founder at the Learning Tree. And then, of course, Lupe, so good to have you here as well with the Indianapolis Foundation, and to share from your perspective as well, from that funding side, from the funder side. And a couple of notes quickly about today. As you're listening in, you may have some questions. And so I would like to invite you, if you have a question come up, if you go to the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A box. And you are welcome to put questions in there as we go along. We'll get to those at the end of the session. That's how you can participate, how you can help us with this transition to trying to think about, well, how can we apply that in our locales? The other thing I was just going to say is you will hear us a lot of times use the shorthand, which is for asset-based community development, which is ABCD. So I just want to make sure you know what this is, what this essentially is. ABCD, and you can always go to ABCD Institute, look them up, and you will find lots of resources and stories of inside out, place-based, relationally focused, equity-centric tools for creating change from the ground up. And so that's what we mean by ABCD when you hear us refer to that. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and get us started. I'll do some moderated discussion piece first. And so I'd like to invite our guests, and I don't know, Lupe maybe be willing to start us off, but just share a little bit about yourself.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. My name is Guadalupe Pimentel Solano, or Lupe, excuse me. I am originally from Córdoba, Veracruz, Mexico. I grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana, went to Pike Township schools, and I have been working for the Indianapolis Foundation since May of 2019. Started as a community leadership officer or a program officer, and currently I'm the director of community leadership and equitable initiatives. And in that role, I have the honor in co-leading our ambassador program with DeAmon Harges, who's also on the call. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Wonderful, excellent. Thank you so much. DeAmon?
So I think, I don't know, Lupe will contend as one of the best organizers in the country, in the world. So I don't know if she talked much about that, but she comes from real grassroots stuff. And also she is my neighbor too, just another interesting space in that. So yes, some DeAmon, besides whatever my vocational accolades are, I'm a proud dad of 2 young adults, very skilled young people, 21 and 28. And I have a wife who I call the biggest philanthropist in my life. I have 2 beautiful dogs that I love to walk. And so I'm an artist, a creative by practice. And that's physically. I like to build things with my hand. At this point in time, I call myself not only the roving listener, but I hold the role as a social banker in Indianapolis, which I help people exchange intangible currencies, abundant currencies that manifest to people being together and doing things and developing new ideas around the common good.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah, so maybe we'll stick with you, DeAmon, if that's all right. Maybe you can kind of give us some context. So you mentioned roving listener, and for a period of time, you've been the roving listener in a neighborhood, and maybe share a little bit about that context and that history and what brought you into this work of, I think in your TED Talk, and I hope everybody went to see that, has gone to see that, but making the invisible visible. But how did you come into this work?
Basically through friendship. It's how a lot of us come into our work and call. My friendship with Mike Mather in 2000. He's also an ABCD practitioner and a local pastor. We met. People thought we should be together in 2000. Mike ended up in Indianapolis. I ended up in Chicago, met my wife, and that was my journey with my family. And in 2003, she was relocated. Just so happened to be located in the same neighborhood that I am in now, our union rep, thinking about gifts and assets. So this neighborhood that I moved into was always labeled as a place that not a good reputation, just say that. It was known by its zip code. And I was a stay-at-home dad, and I would go visit Mike like I did in our past part of our relationship in South Bend. And I would tell him stories about what I was seeing. And I wasn't doing this as a job at first. This is just what I was doing. And I learned a little bit of this from my grandparents about discovering what's beneath, the motivations of people, what gifts, skills, and passions. And at the same time, our congregation was trying to figure out what ways could we be good neighbors as an institution in that place that had long history. And the long history had been, we were a place that asked people only for what they needed. And we were a place that asked to fix people. And now we're shifting, and Reverend Mike came to me and found some support from a local community development corporation in our neighborhood. Also, they lent some support, and he asked me, how would you like to get paid for what you already do? And so that was the beginning. And the roving listener's role is to find the gifts, talents, and dreams and passions of people, finds ways to utilize the gifts in and outside of the community in ways that cultivate community, economy, and mutual delight. And so that was my role. For several years, for example, our church and other folks did a community garden, which there were a lot of residents that didn't show up, and in fact, being disgruntled, and I never knew why. And so as I would go around, in about 6 months, I had discovered 45 gardeners in the 4-block radius. And so the story that was told, the story that I gathered is that no one ever asked people in my neighborhood about what they can contribute. And so that really led into a whole bunch of possibilities. We cultivated young people called the Roving Youth Corps, and their role was to do the same thing, is to find the gifts of people, celebrate those gifts in a public way, and then connect people. And so that's the long story short. I got to do a little bit of consulting work, and, I don't know, like 20 years later, I'm arrived to a bigger point. I founded the Learning Tree. I got called to do consulting in different places. And I was a little bit lonely because my favorite thing is hanging out in my neighborhood with my neighbors. And so my tagline is, I kidnap people to fall in love with each other. So I kidnapped a few neighbors, and we created what we called the Learning Tree. I would share my social capital with folks. They would get contracts for my neighborhood, and then all of a sudden they would give 20% back of that. And so we had discovered the big part of community assets is this idea of generosity that exists in neighborhoods.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Generosity and reciprocity, and we'll be throwing in the Learning Tree website into the chat, so folks can go there, make a purchase or donation. Let's see. So if we could, you are the consummate storyteller. And so I wonder if you would be willing to share, like you say, it's been, 2 decades of doing this work. What would be a story that kind of illustrates the power of working this way of making the invisible visible? What can happen when we live into that way of being as a community?
Well, man, I had tons of stories, but I think what would make sense, because Lupe's on the phone, is tell a story about us meeting. And Lupe and I realized we had met years before she started working at Indianapolis Foundation. And we reconnected because a friend of ours made a connection that she started working there. And I remember Lupe and I, well, we're both very skeptical, and had been in our younger years really skeptical about institutions. And so one of the things I remember her saying, it says, "Yeah, I remember meeting you, and you had your arms folded." And I was like, "Yeah, you did too." And we talked about Lupe. Remember that when we met with Drew and we realized we had met each other, and so that's one kind of connection that goes way back. But in the recent work, in about 2014, my neighbors and I realized in this idea of going around and discovering people's gifts and talents, that there was another thing we missed. So the powerful thing about changing the question, we started creating our little index, an asset map on steroids, and finding out what do people have in the neighborhood. We start recording those out. We had worked with Peter Block and some other communities to say, hey, let's do our cities and to some neighborhoods. And one of the things we did is created new questions about reciprocity itself. So we'd ask questions like, where do you get, and let me go backwards a little bit. So the neighborhood that I'm working in is about 28,000 AMI, so not deep pockets, right? And slowly gentrifying. But at the time, people didn't have a lot of money. And so we started asking people, who do they go to in the community when they need $100, $200, $400? Where do you go to find healing at? And who are the people who care about you? The other question was one of my favorite questions that really struck a chord was, how much money do you give to your friends and cousins that you never expect back? $75,000 in about 4 to 6 block radius around where I live at, that people gave away. And we went back to, we started like, this is amazing.
Yeah.
Like, we're not known as philanthropists, right? We're known as people that need things. And we gathered some folks back together and said, would you be willing to put your money up to a pot, in an investment pot, that you will get a return, a small return by putting it up? And we collected $50,000. We used that to leverage what the young people had discovered, that our community was ready for community-led development. Okay. So in the meantime, one of the things we were doing, well, we had a practice of throwing gatherings, real parties, not a party at the church. This is a party at somebody's house, and there's several iterations of these. Well, I had been friends, since 2007 with the former CEO at Central Indiana Community Foundation and Indianapolis Foundation. He just retired, but he showed up at one of the parties along with some other philanthropists. And this was shortly before Guadalupe got involved there. And he said, hey, I want to be part of this. And we had a discussion about how grant making and philanthropy is different. I said, what my neighbors do, and whether people do in lower income neighborhoods, is philanthropy. They never expect a return on this. And I said, what you do is grant making. And so he had asked, through some other iterations, would I help lead a team, co-lead a team with some people in his place, and it's called the Neighborhood Ambassadors, the Indianapolis Foundation Community Ambassadors. I say that to say, if we hadn't understood how to tell the story about our power as community members, and if we didn't know and actually look at our assets and talk about those things, those invites to the parties would not have been as strong. And so I say that has connected really deep into the work Lupe and I are are really involved in, and how do we create a culture of abundance? Not just one neighborhood, but how do we cultivate a culture, a system where everybody's gifts is welcome?
Yeah, that's amazing. And just to think about that, $50,000, what a great illustration of, again, I think to use your terminology, right? You made visible what was invisible, right? People weren't recognizing the power that the neighborhood has. Yeah, and then from that you start to tell a story, right? And it attracts more. That's amazing. So if I can turn to you for a little bit, Lupe, I wonder if you could share then from your perspective, you're in the Indianapolis Foundation, and somehow you've got this dynamic where the foundation has really embraced the importance of capacity building and supporting, place-based, locally owned change. That's a unique dynamic. So I wonder if you could share a little bit about what is it that led you and the foundation to see the value in that, and how do you go about supporting that capacity building?
Yeah, so thank you. I came to the Indianapolis Foundation in 2019, shortly after, probably about a year after we changed our mission. And so, the Indianapolis Foundation, CICF, made a really bold statement. We changed our mission to say that our mission is to mobilize people, ideas, and investment to make sure that our communities thrive no matter, reach their full potential no matter race, place, or identity. And shortly after that, a few things happened. And so that's kind of how the community ambassadors came to be, because they, after the mission changed, the foundation went out into community to really get feedback from community. I came into the foundation because the foundation did an internal look and saw that they didn't have anyone from the Latinx community. And so I think the mission change really trickled a lot of things, because the Indianapolis Foundation realized that NCICF that we needed to do grant making differently, and so it has been a really powerful journey for us to be in relationship with DeAmon, and to be in relationship with the community ambassadors, and those are relationships that we really center and value throughout our entirety of our work. So, there are times where we reach out to the community ambassadors for feedback on processes, on grant making. So I think for us, the mission was a critical time where we decided things need to change. And I can only speak from 2019 on, because I wasn't here prior to that. But for me, it has been really amazing to be in relationship with DeAmon and others that really value the gifts and talents of the community, because I think a lot of the times in philanthropy, our communities are looked at from a deficit base, because we talk about all the problems, poverty and all these other isms, right? And so we fail to look at gifts sometimes. And so it's been really refreshing to really flip it and look at the gifts.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, yeah. I feel like when that happens, right, when our mindset shifts, it enlivens us in a very unique way, right? So it's not just we're giving grant, but we're inspiring and supporting this amazing abundance, to use DeAmon's language, right, that already exists. That inspires us, right? And so makes us as whatever side of the equation we're on, it's life-giving. So I don't know, DeAmon, if you could take a little bit of time. We've got some questions already coming in, but if you could take a little bit of time, just what kind of advice would you have? Because you've shared that you've had some successes with working with philanthropists and grant makers, but to fuel inside out change. And so I just wonder what kind of tips and advice you would have for our audience.
Well, one, I always look for somebody that, like Lupe, but also her colleague and the vice president, Pam Ross, where this is a lot started from, is one, I say, figure out ways that people can develop real friendships. And so that isn't done at meetings, right? That is done either on walks. So I often take philanthropists on walks, because there's always a power shift who have and have not. If there's a philanthropist, that means, somebody, they're given to somebody. It is so that practice of being there. The other thing on both sides, like what Pam really illustrated, was this idea of being present, making no judgment, and really letting go of power. And I remember Pam Ross, in our first meetings, really put the power back on us. And we were a little we were like, wait, is this for real? Not many times institutions say that. And so for us, how do we start having these really trusted conversations about, what's ailing us, what's stopping us from thinking abundant, both individually and institutionally. So also, it takes, I hope Lupe would tell this story about the Neighborhood Relief Fund, because you were really big, instrumental and part of that. But this idea of you have to do things radical. And so the two folks together have to be willing to upset what's seemingly normal, which in our world, scarcity. And so I'm going to pass it back to Lupe, because this was a shift where the ambassadors, so just to be clear, the ambassadors work in 9 neighborhoods. They're like roving listeners, with an extra added thing of strategy to think about policy different in an abundant way. How do they bring people along? So we were asked during the pandemic, and Lupe, would you please share that story?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I started in May of 2019, which means that in 2020, COVID-19 hit us. And so I say that because the Neighbor Relief Fund was a fund, a local fund to support small grassroots BIPOC-led organizations with funding so that they could deploy it to communities that were being impacted by COVID-19. And so, as I mentioned, our mission change happened in 2018. And I think Neighbor Relief Fund helped show us that there is a way that we could do philanthropy different. And so I say that because given that we were experiencing a global pandemic, we released the Neighbor Relief Fund, or NRF for short, and applications were in our website, in a web page, versus our grant portal. We also mentioned that decisions would be given within 3 weeks, because we knew that there was an urgency in getting money out. So that meant that program officers like myself were reviewing applications within a week and a half, writing up summaries for our committee, which included the ambassadors, and then getting back to the organizations, providing them the decision. And so I think that was our first taste of what doing philanthropy different was, because the grant making decision happened really quickly. There were people involved in that decision making, and so ambassadors and other community members would name really had influence over which applications were competitive. And so I think the Neighbor Relief Fund has been something that we replicate as an institution with other fundings. And I know that the ambassadors have referenced that before and have taken that as wisdom in other areas where they support with grant making. And so, what we call her our fearless leader, Pamela Ross, always talks to us about the fact that really a lot of the times the inequities that happen are just because it's a different decision. So people at the power table just have to decide that different decisions need to be made. And so for us, we decided that for the Neighbor Relief Fund, we needed to shift how we did grant making in efforts to serve a high need that was impacting our communities.
And for an example, one of our ambassadors, Valerie Davis, she and Beatrice Beverly, both on the Near East Side of Indianapolis, kind of two different neighborhoods. Through another ambassador, introduced me to a woman that does Black vegan food. She spends her own money to do these events to get people into veganism and try to cross cultures. Well, she wanted to provide food to folks in community with her friends, and she was one of the folks that got the grant, who normally wouldn't have got that grant. And I have to say that Indianapolis Foundation, this is a big move, and it really upset, and not in a bad way, but really reoriented Indianapolis. There were probably $1 billion coming into Indianapolis during COVID. Everybody's rushing out. And what we had realized, and what Indianapolis Foundation also realized, is that they went to people who are already connected. I say that there were several iterations. IUIA, Latinx group, got some funds. These are groups that normally wouldn't get funds, I say. And these aren't institutions. These are folks with agency together. I mean, they now have nonprofits, but they really act as neighbors. And through that process, it attracted the city. And I remember Deputy Mayor Bennett came to us about deploying money. One of the cool things about Indianapolis Foundation, when the ambassadors gave the deputy mayor a hard time, they didn't interfere. It was great. It was, and Jeff became one of our really good friends, right? He took the feedback, he used some imagination, and he pumped some initial dollars alongside Indianapolis Foundation to also deploy for mutual aid. So residents giving money out to other residents, not an institution, not a community center, you know, and it was close to about $1 million. Now, in the whole scheme of thing, that's not really big when you got 176 million coming for rent assistance. But they gave a portion of this out. The other thing that, because of the NRF, we started really thinking about how grants are looked at. So all the verbiage on the grant is usually based around deficit. And so through the work, we got together as a team, all 9 of us, plus Learning Tree, and we created a form that was 1 page. And in that page, we asked 3 questions that no one asked. What brings you joy? You know, were you good enough to teach somebody else? And who supports you on your journey? And so, you know, this was a amazing thing, because people didn't feel bad leaving out of that place. And most people that filled out, like in federal rules, if you have fixed income, you can't receive rent assistance. So if you got a disability or you're an elder, so how does that show value? And so what the power of an institution can help shape alongside residents new policies. Funding is now, people are trying to do funding different in Indianapolis.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. I appreciate that. And I think even somebody responded in the chat there, but that quote, right? I mean, you're helping us think through differently how we do this, how we interact with each other, including, don't the change happens not in the meetings, but on the walk, right? So thank you for all those tips. Really appreciate that. And I wonder for you, Lupe, we'll transition to some questions here a little bit, but what would you say? And even thinking about, there might be some in the audience who are represent more sort of institutional grant maker types. What would you say to your colleagues, your peers? Why is it important to think differently about what we support, how we fuel civic action?
Yeah, I think for on our end, we know that, our mission is we're accountable to community. And so I think we owe community the ability to kind of think differently. We had been around for 100 years, and we saw that what we were doing was not working right. And so I think it being in a relationship with DeAmon and the ambassadors allowed us to think outside the boxes that we are oftentimes put ourselves in. And so I think for us, it was really, we made a really bold mission, right? And we know that when leaders were on the stage, another bold statement was made that we were going to dismantle systemic racism. And I think for us, there was a lot of hope that gave to community that an institution in a state like Indiana made such a bold mission. And so on our end, personally, I believe that we do owe to community to have these conversations, to think differently about how we're doing grant making and to be in relationship. One of our values internally is authentic relationships, which has been really critical in all of the work that we've done with the ambassadors. And so I think for us, it's the fact that we are accountable to community, which is why it's really amazing to have community ambassadors, to be able to be in relationship with them so that we can have these conversations. There's been times where the ambassadors aren't happy with some of the grant making decisions that have been made, but one of our ambassadors talks about the fact that this is like a relationship or a marriage, right? You might not always agree, but you show up the next day and you know that you're there for each other. And I think that has been really critical in the work.
I think, Eric, there's one of the questions, I think, before we go further. I saw that Jay had a great question, but there's a question in QA, and I think it's important to address now, is that what can new connectors do? I think it is not a connector alone who discovers community. One of the things that we have been discovering, there are roles, these natural roles in communities. My original role, the role that I'm born to do, is an identifier. I was talking to John McKnight about this, and we were talking about who are the roles. But the identifier, those are the people who uncover gifts. They know where every abundant thing is, right? They know from the people to the stories. You have storytellers. I have a neighbor. His title is the Roving Illustrator. And what he does part of the time is make visible the gifts, right? A storyteller they know what has happened. They know how to tell the story for the public, for the common good. The healers. Guadalupe is a healer, and a lot of the ambassadors are healers in the space. And that becomes important because just because we see a gift, it doesn't mean people believe it. Right. And then that happened. I mean, Lupe talked about we love on each other, and that's a primary function that healers, Beatrice Beverly, Valerie Davis, Asida Campos, they're all healers. And mostly all of them have a healing quality. But healers, you need to find healers. You need to find imaginators. So Deputy Mayor Bennett often talks about the way to move things out of government is to talk to community and the imaginators, right? And then you need a social banker, a connector, right? Who has the social capital to be able to integrate all the beautiful gifts and talents that are in and outside the community, and how do they integrate into each other? So it is not just a connector alone. It is these other roles in community of abundance that makes sense.
Yeah, I wonder if we could dig in on that, just because I did see that question from Makia. So coming into that sort of connector, playing that connector role, building the social banker role, where did you start, right? How did you start to uncover gifts? And so, what were the questions? You said you reoriented the questions, but you went and talked with neighbors. So you say a little bit about that.
Yeah. One, never ask a question that is about somebody else's opinion. You want to ask a question that involves people, what they already do. So I never ask people what you think about the neighborhood. Tell me what you do and show me. And who vouches for you, right? Who are the people that support your gift? So the other question, what brings you joy, right? What do you want to fight? We're not asking that. What brings you joy? And there's usually power in that. And when you ask these questions, what you want to do, even if you don't get a chance to ask it, hold it in your head and watch people's facial expression. as their gifts become uncovered. So what a really good block-to-block connector, all they do is pay attention, right? The first step is to look to see what excites people, what motivates people to act in an abundant way, and then asking people to use it more, right? And so it is a sin to ask for somebody's gift if you're not prepared to activate that gift in community.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. I wonder, I'm seeing some questions that kind of are asking, how, if you can share about how that sort of accumulates. And Jay, I don't want to take words from you, but Jay asks, how does an agenda for change emerge that has residents at the center of the dreams, right? So I assume when you activate all those individual stories, that becomes a collective story. I don't know if you could speak into that a little bit, either of you.
Lupe, you want to take it first?
I'll just add one thing about, I think it's important to name, and this is something that I started kind of processing during COVID, is that when we talk about dreams, a lot of times communities that are impacted by, racism and other isms don't have the space to dream because they're fighting to just live day to day. And so I think it's important when it comes to creating those spaces of joy, what brings them joy is critical to be able to get people to start dreaming of what could be. And I just think that's important to name, because one thing that I saw through my time, in community during COVID is that our communities were very defeated. We saw a lot of our, family members, loved one, taken by COVID, right? And the inequities of the impact of, who got impacted by COVID were there. So I just think it's important to name, because that's where relationships and, to DeAmon's point, finding the gifts is critical, because once you see it, you need someone that is able to observe these gifts. And then there is also a responsibility to support with the nurturing of the gift, I think. And that is critical. Relationships are critical in that, but creating the spaces to dream is also very important to be able to get there.
I feel like part of the way it's played out in several of the ambassadors, the play has been really big. Most of them feel that they have power to do things that they didn't have before. I feel like me and my neighbors also feel that. And it reminds me of the chapter in Acts 3, the lame leap for joy. And people think about that section as, oh, the lame was healed. But it was really the congregation being able to see that person a little bit differently. And there were key words: look at us, I see you. You notice those key words. And then the word recognize, which comes from recognate, right? So the congregation and that's what was happening to all of us. So for us, what it looks like physically, we bought a city block. And that didn't happen in isolation. So neighbors that don't have a lot of money pulled their money together, but they utilize these social networks, right? So my neighbors are really keen and they paid attention. They understood which I didn't understand at the time, is how much social capital that I had. Not just social capital, but trusted capital. So they would ask me when we throw a party, hey, invite this person. And then they would find others, hey, invite this person. Hey, this billionaire, can you invite this person? And then they would set up rules behind that. But that eventually brought us collateral. Collateral we already had, just like I told the philanthropic dollars. So the deputy mayor came in and he worked a deal to put a bond up for us to buy this property. Now, I got to tell you that bond was never signed. People trusted that, though. And so the other thing is that Indianapolis Foundation, Pam Ross and others, plus CICF and Impact Central, were able to say, hey, why just buy one building? Why don't you buy the whole block? That means this is, and here's the money without the plan, you come up with a plan later. What we tell poor communities, come up with a plan, leave your jobs, leave everything you do, and do what we say. And this was not like that. And I say that this whole development now we realized that money wasn't at the center of this, relationships were. And so how do you get people to come together? The power of a really good institution, that is power to give platform. So let's not pretend that institutions don't have that. Lots of times institutions pretend or don't see their own power. They think it always evolve around money, but you have other things. You know, what you could do when you're in power and you run $1 billion in assets, you can call the state house, right? So the board members are very powerful. So really understanding the power of ABCD is understanding the collective power of folks. And I think that's what we all discovered together, because I came skeptical. I'm like, I don't know about this foundation, right? Pam and Lupe made it better. And it is a dance, it is a waltz, it is a salsa. It is us figuring this thing out together. I mean, social currency, right? What's in social currency? Trust, right? Trust comes first. Time, which time you can't never get back, what you spend. The social networks, stories. Our stories have brought us a lot of capital. When we tell stories in public ways. We take abandoned buildings, we do things, we take all these things to say, this is who we are.
There is a question about stories. So I don't know if you want to expand on that a little bit. How do you tell the story back to the neighborhood? That was, I think, one of the questions.
Yeah. So you involve everybody to tell their story. So one of the things we did early on when we first started Learning Tree, before we got into the ambassador work, my neighbors are really smart about figuring out, they know where the money at. and so they took me to a meeting, and this group was saying they're going to bring neighbors, artists, and bring beauty to our neighborhood. And I wasn't really that happy with it, but my neighbors knew it. And so I didn't behave so well at the meeting. And my neighbors said, all right, you can leave now. What they did was brought a list of 45 artists. 54 artists in our neighborhood that they just helped me discover. And they brought the list and they said, you'll give us the money and we'll figure out what to do with this $100,000. And so what we decided to do it was to invest in 3 ways. One way is to find all the healers. These are people who throw parties on their porch after 5 o'clock. And we gave them money to throw the best party they could throw. And lots of big parties came out of that. Man, some amazing stuff. We invested in story in 2 ways. So Wild Style, one of the ambassadors, and my neighbor is a hip hop artist. And hip hop artists know other hip hop artists, producers. And most of the folks like to do videos, like music videos. He hired them to tell the story of storytellers. And so one of the stories that came out with it, we found originally 25 doors in the alley. And it was on a Sunday morning, I remember. We're just like, what do we do with this money? How do we involve all 54 artists or any community member that want to share their story? And we called an artist up, and his name was Gary Sharp. And Gary said, he came back with a maquette of 54 doors into a labyrinth, and he called it Perception. And he decided that we would pay each resident to tell their story on the door. Now, this doesn't seem like much, right? So they painted on both sides of the door. I'll send you a video link of the video that they shot. It's a 1-minute video. But we were novices at the time about figuring out program. So we had nowhere to store the doors. Meanwhile, about 3 blocks in a row, there are doors on people's porches. This is kind of unprecedented. You could see the color light up. And we would always get police runs and news channels coming to tell stories about what had happened in our neighborhood. So there was this one instance, one of the families that had a police run 3 blocks away, had the news channel came up, and she says, why do you have a door on your porch? I noticed there are doors. And she starts saying, hey, these folks around the block. And so the news channel did an unprecedented thing and told a story about residents in these doors. That had changed our reputation in our neighborhood, right? So these series of public stories. So that's one way. If you're an institution, like Indianapolis Foundation, what we do together is we share together the stories of each other and what we witness in our neighborhood. We're transitioning to this space of a wider net. Now, how do we share these, hold the mirror up publicly? And this is the power of an institution. Indianapolis Foundation, I mean, I think there's a meeting on Friday, is to talk about how these stories are shared in a public way that gives dignity and integrity, not just to the ambassadors, but to their neighbors, right? As people with power. Lupe, did you want to add?
No, I think you did a good job.
Well, and so the doors, and another question I saw was, what are some other projects that have come to the fore from the ambassador? So how's that playing out? Lupe, do you want to share about?
Yeah, I think so. NRF is just something that really comes to mind. Through NRF, one of the things that come up is it's been really cool to see how some of the organizations that got funding from NRF are now at a space where they have scaled because they chose to, right? And so some of the, I mean, DeAmon mentioned Ayuya, they have now received funding from our competitive round, right? And so that's something I think worth noting. When it comes to other projects, I think each ambassador has it depends on the ambassador. So for example, I think about Ted Hardy. He is known for No Days Off, right? And I think if you ask him about No Days Off, it's really, he talks about the fact that there's no days off for community work, right? Because the ambassadors and people doing community work are getting called because there's so much need. And so, you know, Ted is known for No Days Off. And then I feel like 2 years ago, the Indianapolis Foundation had this idea to launch an app to capture all of our learnings that, all of our learnings through our racial equity journey. And so each app has different pathways. The app is called Movement of 10,000. The last pathway is called No Days Off, basically saying that to become an anti-racist, there are really no days off. Your learning has to be continued on a daily. And so that's something that through Ted's brilliance, we were like, well, this is great. And I think one of the other cool things to note is that we supported Ted in making sure that No Days Off was trademarked, because a lot of the times intellectual property is something that our communities don't really think about, and then we get taken advantage of because of that, right? So Movement of 10,000 and the collaboration with TED is something that pops, like I think of Ms. Beatrice Beverly, I know recently was involved in some grant making for some funding to support mental health. And she, I believe, referenced the Neighbor Relief Fund. So those are two that come to mind, but each ambassador has kind of leveraged their own skills and gifts. Zaida Campos, I think a year ago, took a few community organizers on a retreat. The ambassadors get some funding from us to invest in joy, and the way that Zaida decided to use her funds was to provide local Black Lives Matter organizers with a space where they could just have rest and relaxation. And so that is something that had not been done before. That was really amazing for us to support.
Yeah, and thinking of Ted and few of his friends, they've also they reclaim land and turn it back public. Belmont Beach. I mean, we can go on and on, but the collective, there are several. Beatrice is actually working on policy at the state level for mental health movements. But here's the thing we've done collectively. Before the ambassadors, there wasn't a tenant advocacy program. That story I told about us doing mutual aid, the city came back and asked one of the ambassadors, could you do this? Could you help design this? And he said, no, I love this. He was like, but I know some people. And he pushed this out in community. There would be no support for residents if the ambassadors didn't do that. So there's collective action in this. there's there's an ambassador that now has a donor advised fund, created her own donor advised fund for her neighborhood. Right. And so there are a whole bunch of ways. I mean, there's lots of other things that they also combat on the way. Like they come up against really bad policies around policing and things like that. And so there have been a lot of push. So there's individually and collectively. And before we had, people would say we would have rap sheets, and now we're leaving out with portfolios. So
I was gonna just give DeAmon a quick, Eric, because when it comes to the donor advice fund, I think that is an example of DeAmon planting a seed. Someone that, when we talk about dreaming, right, Ms. Beatrice didn't think about what that would look like, and DeAmon saw the philanthropist in her, cultivated that. I'm sure it didn't take a month for that to happen. It took some believing in Ms. Beatrice that she was a philanthropist, and then for her to act on that. And so hearing the story from DeAmon and Ms. Beatrice, how that happened was beautiful, because I think it's an example of how you see a gift, cultivate it, and then support the person through it.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you so much, Lupe. And we're coming close to our hour, which is just breaks my heart. It's such a rich conversation. So let me read a couple of quotes here from the chat first, and then I'm going to end with one of the questions we haven't gotten to yet, but we probably won't have time for this one last one. And there, Dave is wondering, in my community, I want to support. In your story, Lupe, it was the match of Beatrice and DeAmon, right? DeAmon believing, and so how do you fund the DeAmons of my community, the connectors of my community, the social bankers of my community? How do you patch together the funding so that person can start that cycle, that upward spiral of believing in the Beatrices, who then go on and do amazing things for the neighborhood? So I want to get to that, but let me read these quotes. Wow, DeAmon, this is from Bridget. Powerful, incredibly articulate, and creative with using her verbal word art. Social banker kidnapped neighbors and to describe the work being done. I'm passing this video on to neighbor, and then they're passing on a video about a Pittsburgh work that's happening there. Then another quote here, Lupe, thank you for highlighting looking to what is happening in the community versus deficit scarcity mentality, which attracts the same. So again, we're so grateful for the both of you and the many ways you blessed us today with your stories, with your energy. So thank you. So let's, if you don't mind, unpack that question for a little bit. A community that wants to get started, and so they're thinking about how do we get our DeAmons funded, our connectors funded, our social bankers funded, so all this stuff starts to spin.
Yeah, I attended a conversation by Reverend William Barber a year ago, and he said something that was really powerful. And he named that budgets are moral documents. And so I say that because our partnership with Learning Tree does not come through a competitive grant cycle. We fund that through an investment plan. And so every year we, write up a narrative why we are going to continue our relationship or funding this work, and that goes to the board. And so I say that because that then takes the proposal, the request out of the competitive into a different pool of fund. And I think it's one question I would say is, if you're wanting to get started in this, I would have you answer why, right? Why are you getting it started on this? Like, what is your reasoning? And then what is your commitment to it? And I think for us, it has been a real a blessing that we have leadership that believe in this work. And so every year we're able to, write up that to the board and fund it through an investment plan versus our grant cycles. So I think that's what I would say. I would end with Reverend Barber in the fact that our budgets are moral documents, and how do we kind of hold that?
And the other thing that the ambassadors don't work for Learning Tree or Indianapolis Foundation. They get paid for what they already do. Coming back to the circle. And I think the best thing that folks starting is look for those archetypes, the roles, who are the healers in your community, support them. Who are your identifiers? Who are your storytellers, the imaginators, and your social bankers? And you support them. You support them as learning partners. So when we draw up our contract with, we're providing also a service, all of us, right? And it's a service of love. But we write this up as you're learning on side of us. We're learning together. It is not just a basic service you do and we tell you what to do and you do what we need. This is discovery.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Again, I just hate that we're having to wrap this up. We feel like we're just getting started. So I do want to note for those that are listening in today, usually this is a quarterly conversation that we host just for our growing community of ABCD enthusiasts. There's been some real interest in a couple of stories, and so actually each of the next few months we'll have one of these conversations, and so those are dropped in the chat. Seth Kaplan is up next. He's a researcher on neighborhoods and and got a book coming out in October, and so he's going to come and talk to us about all
one of the smartest mans on the planet.
He's if you're going to follow anybody on LinkedIn or whatever, just follow him and you'll get all the stuff. Okay. And then Edmonton, Canada. I mean, you don't want to miss that. In November, we're going to talk with Edmonton about, because it gives you a picture of, if you're at this, if you're supporting the DeAmons of your community and the Lupes of your community for 100 years, what can happen, right? Because that's what they've done. And so that's going to be an amazing conversation as well. And then we'll come back to Holland, Michigan in December and talk about their blueprint for flourishing neighborhoods and the Connector program that's emerging there that could be a model for your community. Okay. Lastly, again, I want to say the Giving Tree, go there if you want to keep things going in Indianapolis. Donate, buy, whatever you can do there. Great Lakes Urban. Our passion is for new neighborhoods that want to come into their own ABCD journey. And I will tell you, I'm riding on a bike this Saturday to raise support for our seed grant program, which helps new neighborhoods get started. So we dropped a link there for our rockcycling.org website for the event. Jay, who introduced us, he'll also be riding. Come in, support our rides, and guess what? You'll be supporting new neighborhoods as they move into this kind of a journey, as we've seen and can happen in Indianapolis. So keep track. We will. A question did come in. Yes, we've recorded this, and we will send the recording out. It's just too rich to keep to ourselves, right? We got to get this information out. So, I think that's all that I have. And so I just, again, a deep thank you, and I'm seeing thank yous coming in from other little places as well. Just thank you, Lupe. Thank you, DeAmon. This has been a rich time, and we appreciate you so much. So with all that, also thanks to everyone that came and participated. And let's keep this learning journey going. We'll see you next month.